the code of conduct. Please do remember that we are here to uplift and be excellent to each other. And if you feel that someone has not been excellent to you or to others, please reach out to an organizer or a volunteer. With all that being said, let's introduce a few of our organizers and then kick off with our keynote speaker, Taylor Barnett. It's a pleasure to invite our first keynote speaker for DevOps Days Texas 2021, Taylor Barnett. Taylor is a senior community engineer at Transposit, and she's passionate about building great technical user experiences with an emphasis on empathy within product and documentation. And she spends a considerable amount of time thinking about API integrations, as we all do. In her free time, she's either climbing rocks, trying to find funky as funk sour beers, and just hanging out with her corgi, Yoda, in Austin, Texas. Taylor, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Barnett, and I'm here in Austin, Texas. I'm super excited to be with you giving this talk at DevOps Days, Texas. You know, before I start, I just want to say I know it's been a hard week or hard weeks for many of us, and it's okay to not be okay. Things will get better. If you're watching this live, I feel very privileged to have you here with me. If you're watching this later, also super excited that you're watching this. It's totally okay if you need to like peace out for a bit. And so let's get into the talk. So I have this hypothesis that people dislike glue work because of bad past experiences. Maybe it was because of something to do with operating and developing some kind of system or integrating some kind of tool. Maybe it was reoccurring incidents that always came back to that one thing that was integrated. Or maybe it's even that you didn't see personal growth while doing this kind of work. And the reality is, the road to improving our experience of glue work has not necessarily been great. It's been largely focused on application development, and the other technical sides of things like platform and operational experience sometimes has gotten the back burner, or even the people aspect of it, has lagged. And the reality is, a small team or even a large team in a large organization can't just make this better on their own. It's a bigger cultural change in how we develop and how we operate and how we organize our teams and what we incentivize and what our responsibilities are. At the same time, tooling is interlaced with some of these human problems, and a bad API can actually make our work a lot harder, and also make the parts that involve people even harder. But first, what is glue? So when I talk about this idea of glue work, what am I talking about? Often we joke that we're piecing together software with glue and popsicle sticks, but sometimes those glues are pretty damn effective. My definition of to glue is to integrate different parts of a system together that would otherwise be incompatible. You know, this can be different things to different people. Tanya Riley gave a talk about glue work and where she came up with this term and said, it was the less glamorous and often less promotable work that often is needed to make a team successful. It's without it, projects would fail, communication would break, and it would just be really hard to get certain things done. You know, glue can be a lot of different activities. It can be that human work that Tanya talks about in her talk, that you should definitely go look up. It's the work that makes a team run and be successful. It can also be design. How do we build systems that contain many different parts, and how do we piece those together? And then what I want to talk about today is the code that we write to integrate with other systems. It's APIs, it's integrations. That's what I want to focus on for this talk. We have this patchwork of tools and services. you know, this has come out of many years of change in the industry. And while sometimes it can feel like a mess now, like if you've ever looked at the cloud native landscape, it has got so many different things in it, and it can, make you have nightmares sometimes. But this is the reality of where we are today. And the thing is, glue is complex. People aren't always rewarded for doing it well. Uh, you know, Often it is just seen as piecing things together. But really, in reality, it takes a lot of communication and documentation and evaluating different designs and how to implement them, and vendors. And it's a lot more complicated than just piecing things together. And we're often left to solve this on our own. There are few developer and operator experiences out there today that enables us to do this glue work with many different runtimes, tooling, and vendors, and actually have a great experience. It's so fragmented across how many tools we're using. And then the other thing is, glue code isn't always seen as project code. So we also, it feels like this thing that's on the side. Even think about when you're using AWS services together. There's a lot of pain points just when you're using all AWS services, and that's under one vendor. So we're often left to solve this for ourselves in our code bases. And it's something we think a lot about at Transposit. We integrate with like over 200 APIs on our platform. And how do we actually have those talk to each other nicely is a big problem. And so you may ask yourselves, well, how did we get here? How are we in this position where we're in this patchwork of tools and services? And so first there was AWS. So you're in the early 2000s, Amazon was trying to figure out, how to onboard these third-party merchants that they were going to be using their e-commerce platform, and how to bring them on to their platform quickly and in a repeatable way. And at the same time, they were doing a lot of internal development on the Amazon.com site. And they started seeing a pattern of these problems. There was a need for internally scalable and reliable infrastructure services. And they were starting to hear these from their external partners too. But also at the same time, after 10 years of Amazon.com, they had started building up this infrastructure competency. They were actually, not so bad at it. And so they decided to build that as a separate service. But how would these services talk to their external partners? And what they came to realize was APIs was the answer. And not only did that help them, be able to build these services for external partners, but also help them decouple different layers. For example, the data was tightly coupled with a presentation layer, and that was causing problems. And so it opened up possibilities of what they could do when they decoupled this. And at the time, it was a pretty new idea. Everything was most of the time tightly coupled. There wasn't this idea of using these external services in the industry, and it was pretty revolutionary for the time. Like any industry that has grown and evolved, a supply chain has formed around it. Think physical goods like cars, for example. Um, you know, Automotive companies like Ford and Toyota and others don't produce every single part themselves. They buy metal from a metal company, tires from a tire company, who then also buys rubber from a rubber company. And there's hundreds and hundreds of these suppliers in a chain. And it helps the industry be more effective and productive. And what has come in software is that we've now started to develop our own supply chain. It allows the industry to segment and allows companies to focus on what their core competencies are. Infrastructure companies is now just one of our suppliers. And these software supply chains are heavily made up of this APIs and these components, just like a car part. We take chunks of code, we piece them together and make finished applications. And with this, we've solved a lot of old problems. Think about the problems that AWS was solving. Those are old problems now. But with that, we've discovered this whole new set of new problems. And this is the next big leap. This is where we're going. But first, before I go any further, I just want to introduce myself, why this idea of glue work and APIs and integrations is like really interesting to me. So APIs really were something like fundamental to me early on when I started developing. It got me to change a programming language at one point because I didn't want to deal with installing all the stuff to run an SDK in Java. And I was like, oh, this like Python thing looks interesting. And these instructions are a lot easier to get a Flask server up and running. And so it definitely was something that was very early on. These like, oh, this is a better experience. And how can that better experience happen? Through APIs. As a software engineer, APIs were powering many of the features I was building. When I got more into developer experience, I saw the struggles people were having while using APIs. So then I decided to go work at an API design tooling company. And then from there, I was introduced to Open API specification, formerly known as Swagger, which I participate in still today. And that brought me to Transposit. And, at Transposit, we have the saying that, you've got the building blocks and we've got the glue. We're building something that brings your entire stack together and codifies processes, everything from incident response to service requests. And a lot of that is taking, how can we do integrations better? And that's kind of what makes the dream work happen. So where do we go from here? Where are we headed? Charity Marriagers, one of the co-founders of Honeycomb, has this quote that unless you're an infrastructure company, infrastructure is not your mission. Sure, it would be helpful to build up that, internal expertise. It may be useful, but every second you spend on infrastructure or other code is, something you could have been using to build out a whole new feature. It can often build on itself. And next thing you know, your time has been totally spent on solving this one infrastructure problem that is solved by, potentially just using another service. And this idea is not changing. We're not going to suddenly say, oh, we should all be building all of these building blocks ourselves. And so with this being the future, we need to learn how to outsource well. Charity has described vendor engineering as, and I love this, effectively outsourcing components of your infrastructure and weaving them together into a seamless whole. This requires certain types of architectural skills and domain expertise that are both rare and often undervalued, especially considering how pervasive the need for this is, as we've seen the change in how we build software. How do you pick a vendor, but how do you also push for that adoption internally? Often when we're looking at a vendor, we have, a few things that we're considering, but if we broke it down to the most simple is how compatible is it with our current stack and the tooling that we're using and the languages and the run times and, where we host it on and all different stuff like that. What are the use cases we need it to provide for us? And then also just getting team buy-in. And often too limited solutions get tossed really early on. And I think we need to sometimes open our minds just a little bit and figuring out what is, still an all right solution, even if it isn't perfect. And not every problem is like some special snowflake problem. There's often like other things that could be changed within them to make it more compatible with something. And so one of the things we need to figure out is how to ask good questions to gauge compatibility and fit. What friction can we deal with? And what is just like a total deal breaker for the situation? How do we calculate and qualify the cost to develop and operate? If it's unreliable, that is a cost to consider. That is going to put more of a burden on our team. And at the same time, we need to remove as much as labor as possible because, again, that is taking away time that we could be better spending on other things. We need to consider the true cost of ownership and advocate internally. Um, Also that might mean managing up to executive and finance teams. I know the number of times that teams have tried to get a contract signed with a vendor, but there was pushback around pricing. Management is not going to see the incidents that never happened because you picked one more reliable vendor over another. So you need to find ways to communicate that, and the ones that resonate with them and their concerns. And we need to learn how to reward team members for doing this work well. Is this work explicitly in a career ladder? Is it invisible? Because many times glue work is invisible. Um, Also, maybe it isn't seen as interesting or cool because it's not building something from scratch. And so it doesn't get the same credit. How do we make sure to still reward, the time that was saved by using some of this glue? You know, Managers can elevate this glue work to help people see that bigger impact of their work, and that piecing together services takes strategy and design. I think to this one thing I often do when I'm implementing an API, I write a document with the areas that I have friction with, that I struggle with, why I made certain design choices. Sometimes I link out to different documentation that the API has on their site. And many times when I'm writing this document, it isn't something that I even think I'll go back to the next week or the week after. Many times I come back to that document 12 months later and find it useful. Or a team member who might be working in that area of the code base is like, hey, I know you worked on this thing. Like, can you share any information? And I pass along the doc and they're like, oh, wow, we don't even need to meet anymore because this explains everything that is needed. Are you rewarding people for that kind of work? But the reality is, even if you do the vendor engineering piece well, things will break. There will be incidents, there will be outages, especially when we think of a lot of these just-in-time models like payments and authenticating and communication APIs. That everything is happening in much more real time. And we will get 503 errors because a service is now unavailable. What do you do in these situations? You think I think often about the S3 outage in 2017. It was the big one that brought down even the AWS status page, as well as many different websites. And I decided to go look at the Keen.io API status page from that day because I remember that incident even now, many years later. Um, and the awesome thing that status page reminded me about was our website partially broke because we were storing some things in S3, but the API itself was okay. Yeah, the S3 streaming feature we had did not work at the time, but we couldn't do much about that. But we were still able to have users send in data, and we had very little disruptions, And part of that was because we were decoupled enough that it could affect one part or one feature, but did not affect the whole API. And so when these services break, we could break. And this is where glue work becomes much more complicated and, to me, much more interesting. How do we build systems that handle these failures? Yeah, that API that we may have bought might have been cheaper, but is it bringing our business to a grinding halt? Like, how do we make sure that does not happen? And so the reality is failure will happen. Learn to handle it gracefully. We need to be able to cope with failures and performance availability. Things will go down, but how do we grow from that? How do we mature from when they do happen, or prevent it from even happening in the first place? And this, to me, is where the interesting problems live. How do we make these systems more reliable? It's not just about integrating an API, which sometimes is what it feels like when it's very tedious and annoying. But it's like problems like connections